starting our topic, which is very interesting, but also is not well researched. It's a relatively new topic. It's about the connection between resource curse and conflicts. Both myself and Professor Ibadoghlu mentioned already that one of the few conditions or indicators or consequences of resource curse is conflicts, among others. So we're gonna see whether resource curse leads or is expressed itself in conflicts, and what are the mechanisms connecting these two phenomena. So the main question which this lecture will try to answer, whether rich resources lead to conflicts in domestic conditions and in regional or international conflicts, whether it can be source of conflicts, or is there any other connection between the resources and conflicts. So our plan for today will be, first of all, I'll give you a general idea of political economy of conflicts. There is such a field within the security studies and within the development studies. And then we'll see specifically within that framework how primary commodity or resource curse or rentier states affect conflict. And the last part of our discussion will be about so-called petro-aggression, on whether the petrostates or states with a high mineral dependency can be source of international or regional conflicts. Well, first of all, we'll start with political economy of conflicts. The usual question among political economists about conflicts, what is more primary, greed or grievance? Basically, the idea is, when do people start fighting within the country? We're speaking now of the domestic conditions, domestic area. Is it because of the greed? So people are competing to take control over resources when they are in place, or it's about grievances that people fight when they want to bring justice because they are deprived, because they are poor, because they are discriminated. Well, if in fact, when we will move further, we'll see that these two things are related, more or less, and they are related through the petrostates and resource curse phenomena. So within the development studies, the scholars are not so much interested in conflicts, but when the conflicts are taking the form of wars, which in turn lead to the humanitarian emergencies. And a couple of decades ago, there was a big project by a UN university and Oxford University on the root causes or political economy of complex humanitarian emergencies. Complex humanitarian emergencies, they include the war, hunger, and displacement. So that's when the political economists move in and they start to find the deep causes behind the conflict, which turned into and has such a devastating effect. We will use, because of the approaches and theories we're going to discuss, we're going to use a few terms, other terms which we didn't use before. For instance, primary commodity. It's a term which covers raw resources and roughly is divided into groups: agricultural and mineral resources, ore and metals. We will again, I'll just remind you what is resource curse, which we've been discussing before. The term which was first used by Richard Orty in 1993, so that countries dependent on mineral resources have lower economic growth, among other consequences, but this is the main. And Sachs and Warner confirmed that dependence of mineral resources and lower economic growth. And we will also use the term rent-seeking behavior, which is slightly different from rentier states, because it is related to behavior of elites, leaders, politicians, and this is about seeking to increase the share of existence wealth without creating a new wealth. It's basically all the same as rentier, but it's more specific for the group of actors. So political economy wars divide roughly on two groups, the wars by economic resource base and economic growth, so the causes of wars. So on the one hand, you have land scarcity in rural areas, and Burundi, Haiti, Sri Lanka, Myanmar. These cases of instability are explained by the authors of political economy of wars and conflicts as those which are caused by land scarcity. Usually they're exacerbated by diverse ethnic groups who live there, especially like in Kosovo and Rwanda. And on the other hand, the economic resource base mineral reaches, which create this conflictual dynamic. And as an example, they bring conflicts in Sierra Leone, Angola, Colombia, Iraq, Nigeria, Liberia. Some of them are integrated in world economy, some of them are not. And then we have the classification based on economic growth and equality. The wars, which are turning into complex humanitarian emergencies, are likely to emerge in lower income economies with slow growth, like Ethiopia and Afghanistan. They also can emerge in the condition of relative deprivation. Relative deprivation is when my situation, although relatively it might not be as bad as compared in absolute terms, it might not be as bad as one might think, but compared to my expectations and perception, so what is called relative deprivation, it increases probability of conflicts together with economic decline, inequality, changes of production, and competition for resources. And also, the typology of conflicts can be based on whether there are over immobile resources, as I already mentioned, land, or mobile resources like oil, diamonds, water, and timber. They can be also over control over valuable resources themselves, or the labor, capital, technology, trade routes, market access, transportation routes, etc. Then the issue is coming, which is usually being very intensely discussed, whether it happens in the places which are poor with resources or rich with resources. There is more and more studies, particularly recently, which confirm that the rich areas or countries with rich resources are more prone to conflicts, or conflicts are more generated by value and wealth and less by poverty and bankruptcy. At least that's the approach by Professor Fairhead from Oxford. How do conflicts and complex humanitarian emergencies happen? Well, here is my favorite dichotomy, structure and agency. Last time we discussed it also, the structure and agency. What are the objective reasons? The objective or repeated pattern which leads to humanitarian emergency is economic decline, poverty and inequality, while agency is policy actions. And agency means that the leaders or politicians or rebel leaders, they have a choice in policy. This is less deterministic than the one which we were discussing before, like Terrell and Carl and things like that. But they also stress that there are certain conditions which prepare the basis for the conflict. And we already also mentioned it before. It's post-colonial situation, neo-patrimonial structure of state, strong leader at the top of patronage, clientelism and repression, and combination of weak state and rentierism, or the extreme form of rentierism is predation, predatory state. And the combination of all these factors very highly likely leads to conflicts. If you look at this table, you will see that most of the countries which had conflicts, they did indeed have mineral, either you see gems or mineral or carbon resources, which basically works in favor of the idea that the conflicts take place in the places where there is resource availability. You can also see that the other indication of the conflicts is also present there in sub-Saharan Africa, a very high level of income inequality. So the idea of one of the approaches to the political economy of conflict by Raimo Vauranen, for instance, from UN University, was that conflicts appear when the weakness and rentierism join each other. So what do we understand under weak states? It's incapacity to exercise the political and economic control over its territory, state's territory. And rentier states, we've been studying it before. Rulers use state's capacity to extract or mobilize resources to accumulate wealth and political influence at the expense of population. You should remember that about extract or mobilize, because these are two different things which lead to different consequences. And rent seeking also is present. We just discussed it. It's a policy to obtain private benefit from public action and resources. Vauranen is also stressing that rent seeking actually is not as bad. Predation is much worse. It's a strong form of despotism and economic exploitation which neglects social goods and even neglects its own reproduction. So predation, usually a short-term enterprise, and it may end up in conflict with much higher probability, and it might be either domestic conflict or external conflict. And this happened because the weak states and predatory states, they prefer extraction versus mobilization. So extraction of resources can be internal, either taxes of coercive means. For instance, we can, extraction of resources might be, it's very typical. For instance, back home in Azerbaijan, we have so-called Heydar Ali Foundation. And this foundation might come any minute to any small enterprise and say, we need $5,000 for our foundation. And the small enterprise or even medium enterprise has no other option but give. It's basically racketeering, but it's what is called extraction of resources domestically. And it can be also external, because when you are reach certain level, limits of extraction domestically, you may turn to the territorial expansion, for instance. So mobilization of resources is different. It's intervention of states in the economy to stimulate new activities or stimulate non-state actors to generate new values. There might be external mobilization, foreign aid, borrowing, direct investment, and things like that. So weak states usually tend to extract rather than mobilize resources. It's a source of extractive or even predatory rule, which is conducive to conflicts. So, but what provides for stability? Why not always the weak or rentier states, they erupt in conflicts? It's a sharing formula. For instance, one of these sharing formula, when you have rents or you have resources, the way how you distribute it very much provides for stability. For instance, the amount of assets distributed beyond the narrow circle of rulers' proxies. Cooptation of wider circles help to provide for stability. The more predatory rule is the smaller circle of beneficiaries. Usually they bring the example of Ghana and economic decline from 1960s to 1980s, but contrary to expectations, there was no violence because of the small rural resources of economy, which were insufficient to maintain pervasive rent seeking, so they had to strike deals with small producers. Economic growth can also cause instability because it may shatter sharing formula, but usually stability is more challenged by the economic decline. Which societies are more vulnerable to conflicts? The classical political economy says that this is usually two kinds of societies. One is which is characterized by rural poverty, and political stability is based on exploitation of rural population, which produces rents, and it's transferred to the urban population, mainly the politicians, bureaucrats. So conflicts also dependent on primary commodities. The societies which are vulnerable to conflicts are in the countries which are dependent on primary commodities. So rents are distributed by coalition of domestic and foreign stakeholders. If in case of rural poverty, the rents are distributed within the society by the local coalitions, in the states where dependent on primary commodities, rents are distributed by coalition of foreigners and locals. In this case, Burma, before the democratization and the elections, in Burma there was control over drugs and hardwood trade, which provided resources to the SL or RC, which was armed by China and Singapore. So the conflicts and humanitarian emergencies are a result of exclusion of people from benefits and by increased militarization and repressions. So as we saw, primary commodities or countries dependent on primary commodities, including mineral resources, they are characterized as those prone to the conflict. So even within the major framework of political economy of wars and conflicts. And now we are coming to the specifically the topic of our course, and this is how resource curves and conflicts specifically are connected. And we start with the domestic causes of conflicts. So there are basically two approaches. One is rent seeking, so greed-based insurgency. So if you take the country and there is like large mineral resources or diamonds or some other very valuable resources which produce high rents, very often rebellion might be caused by simply competition for the control over these resources. There was also the study that in the oil-rich states, the number of opportunistic rebellioners crowd out the political or ideological ones, which means that structurally speaking, if you have the availability of large rents, the rebellion might be motivated by greed rather than ideology or politics. And then the second approach is more complex and more indirect. It's not that availability of large rents create the motivation for fighting for them. It's indirect via weakening state. It starts with the fact that all these phenomena which we discussed before, that availability of rents deliver you the ruler from necessity of taxation, absence of taxation weakens the state institutions, bureaucracy is weakening. So basically, state weakens and becomes more vulnerable to its insurgency and rebellions. We will speak more about these two approaches. So let us remain Michael Rose, who counted that between 1960 and 1999, and the study covered 5,436 countries, 90 civil wars began. 29 of them were states which start with 100 dollars per capita petroleum, and 12 in states which starts with $1 per capita of diamonds. So what does resource wealth do? It increases the value of state as a target. So that increases the competition for political power. It increases value of sovereignty in mineral-rich regions. For instance, if the mineral resources are, as usual, they are located in one region of the country, the population or elites of that region might be interested in secession. So that also motivates the secessionist movement. So it also, the resource wealth, help finance rebels. Again, as I said, it weakens the state, and conflicts also emerge through trade shocks, meaning that it fluctuates when the price of oil, for instance, falls down. So here you have a shock, and this creates this extreme situation which might lead to the conflict because it leaves and destroys the whole sharing formula in the society. So, and besides that, resource wealth actually can lengthen civil wars. If the civil wars, if resource wealth did not necessarily start the war or was the reason of the beginning of the war, availability of this wealth actually contributes to the continuation of the conflict. So Michael Ross also speaks about channels of connection of primary commodity and conflicts more specifically. As we already mentioned, the primary commodity experts provide sources of rebels, financing, for instance, diamond financed rebellions in Sierra Leone and Angola, and oil. Oil can be illegally taken through tapping, through ransoming, through, other illegal sources. And rebels also might be motivated to capture rents. As I said before, so that was what I quoted before about that in the country rich with resources, the opportunist rebels, they crowd out the political or political or ideological ones. And very often these rebellions have secessionist nature. So the other reason how the primary commodity and conflict is related is the governments in resource-rich states are less accountable to its citizens. And this way may provoke rebellion too. So I don't know if you can see it. I can hardly see it. But this is the table which proves that in the countries rich with petroleum, the separatist movements very often are likely to happen, particularly if the oil is produced in that region. And if you can see of this sample, more than a half cases took place in such regions. They were connected, basically. So to summarize, we can say that resources can finance conflict, and one of the examples to counteract it, and you know, Paul Collier is very sort of prominent in how he provides for recommendations to counter resource curves. So when resources can finance conflicts, you can undertake some international initiatives like Kimberley process in regards the diamonds and trying to neutralize the amount of the illegal diamond trade. Resources can motivate conflicts, secessionist conflicts mainly. Resources can induce patronage politics, and resources can generate shocks, which in turn they affect or they cause conflicts. So the other thing is that there is a contradiction, however, is whether the rentier states cause conflict. The thing is that very often that resource curse or mineral resource dependency cause conflicts, but rentier effect actually leads to stabilization. So there is this contradiction between two. So to the question, does rentier economy cause conflict? Collier says that probably not directly, because directly it actually leads to stabilization. Look at the states like in Saudi Arabia or United Arab Emirates. They are quite stable. There are stable states, rentier states, but very stable for many years, for decades actually, which are in Central Asia. And we will come to that case later. So this is a very legitimate question. Does rentier economy cause conflict? So Collier says the rent effect is indirect. It's via political economy, which leads to the failure or growth process. It affects the conflicts via non-tax revenue and via shocks. So, as I said, why in some cases stability, not as conflict? So Basadao said that the explanation to this phenomena, that in one case it has stabilizing effect, rentier has a stabilizing effect, lies in the per capita revenues. So the higher per capita revenues, the more stable is the regime. So he basically comes up with two suggestions. One is countries with very high revenues per capita will be secured from conflicts, even if highly dependent on resources. However, shock may increase the probability through decline of revenues. So it's not forever either. And they maintain peace. How do rentier states, which provide for stability, how do they maintain peace? They do it through four ways. First, large-scale distributional policies. So basically, the more people they live happy with distribution of rents, the more probability that it will be stable. Through clientelist networks, so it's the proxies in the key areas of control, which they make also keep happy and high spending of security apparatus to provide for repression if there is something going, wrong, and through external allies. Let's see how this Rentier stabilizing and destabilizing effect works in Central Asia. Of 5 states of Central Asia, 2 of them are quite poor. It's Kyrgyzstan and poor with resources, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. The other 3 are quite high in resources, in particular Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan. If you look at the per capita mineral export income in Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan, you will see quite much higher than in the other states, Central Asian states. They are all characterized, except for Kyrgyzstan, they are all characterized by quite autocratic government. But if you look at the stability, it's 2 of them, exactly those with high per capita income, which have been relatively stable for quite a few decades. And if you look at this one, there are the 3 others with the low per capita income. The interesting thing is that the African states, sub-Saharan Africa, for instance, while they are characterized by instability, there is one country which is sort of exception, and it is being explained by many political economists as a exception in the sea of the instability caused by resource dependence. So Botswana hasn't been torn by conflicts because it has had strong checks and balances institutions. That's how the scholars explain it. And in spite of high political pressure, the governance resisted resource curse. So we're speaking about agency not being defined or determined by the resource curse. So there was deliberate policy of the government to resist the pressure of resource curse. So first of all, they established very strict control over expenditures, and any excess revenue was used for foreign exchange reserves in the Bank of Botswana, for using it in the cases when there are shocks and things like that. So there are exceptions, and there are cases when oil abundance does not lead to conflicts. It's not necessarily because it is the high ratio of oil per capita. The other research showed that risk of primary commodity is mainly related to oil. So it's much less to the agricultural rents or any other dependence. It's the highest conflict-prone economies is the one which is dependent on oil, and it's because of the exceedingly large rents. And we remember that rents are defined as high value of the product relative to its production cost. So to conclude, resource rent do add risks of conflict, does add risk of conflict, but indirectly via long-term growth. Another mechanism of increasing risk of conflict is looting. So The question which many try to answer, why do elites loot? And when do they loot? They say that it happens when the time horizons are short. So the less time you have, the more you loot, the more you're motivated to get as much as possible. Then they say the size of group also matters. The smaller is the size of your proxies, of your support base, the bigger is incentive to loot. If it's very often it's a small ethnic group which is in charge, a regional or family clan. When public assets are very valuable relative to the income of society, that's a very important notion, because taking into account the low income society, but high resource, valuable and rich resources, the incentive to loot also increases. When democratic electoral competition degenerates into a patronage politics. In general, Collier, for instance, says that democratic competition is not as important to prevention of conflict, or broader, if we take it broader, for the positive outcome of the resource curse. Because in the absence of the due process, in the absence of the rule of law, strong bureaucratic institutions, checks and balances, even democratic electoral competition turns into the patronage politics. And we mentioned before that in such countries, in resource-rich countries, the opportunist politics is taken over the ideological one, that people start simply being motivated to take control over resources and enrich themselves when they take control over. Now we come to the second part of our lecture, and it's more complicated because there is much less research in this area. More specifically, it's about how resource curse affects the international conflict, or whether the countries which are dependent on mineral resources, they are more prone to start conflict. Before we come to this specific question, I will just make a brief review of something which we all know, that oil in general, internationally, and during the history, particularly during the last century, was a very strong commodity to fight for. It was source of the expansionist wars. It was source of various other wars. So this is the level of energy security. It has nothing to do with petrostates yet. We're just discussing it in a more sort of shallow, let's call it shallow level. So the oil might lead both to conflicts and stability internationally, or can actually add to already existing conflict. For instance, if you take Baku, where myself and Professor Ibadoghlu is from, we're from a very attractive region in this regard. It has the oldest history of oil, which we discussed last time. But also the Red Army was trying to get there. Let me show you. when the Red Army was occupying Caucasus, there is a famous telegram which Lenin, the leader of Russian Revolution, sent to Orjonikidze, his a member of the Revolutionary Council, in March 1920. He said, to occupy Baku is extremely, extremely important for us. And Baku was the source of Russian Empire power internationally. The Baku oil was famous in the end of the 19th century, which helped Russia actually to win over America in the markets, in the oil market. So Baku was very important for Bolsheviks. Unfortunately, Democratic Republic of Azerbaijan existed only 2 years, from 1918 to 1920. And the second time, Baku became part of the pie. It's a very interesting documentary, which I would advise you to see. It's in Google. You can find it in Google. It's called documentary Objective Baku, Hitler, War on Oil. And this is a famous scene when the Hitler and his colleagues, whoever they are, they're cutting the chart, which is called Caucasus Sea, Caucasus Mir, and there is peace which is given to Hitler, which is called Baku. So Azerbaijan looks like a Baku, and its oil looks like a reward for the occupation and expansion. There is also a very interesting phenomena which is called peace pipelines. So the idea that transportation routes might be not only source of transportation or routes of supplies, but also source of reconciliation of the fighting parties, or animosity between, reconciling the animosity between various actors, international actors, was quite popular. One of such projects was peace pipeline called Iran-Pakistan and India. The talks which began in 1994, it was about gas pipeline. And because Pakistan was highly dependent on natural gas, the searches for the sources of gas basically pushed him to, yes, exactly, we will discuss it too, up as well. So Iran, Pakistan, India, this project was not going well because, as you understand, of the resistance of the US, and Pakistan at a certain point had to hesitate. And so there were drop-offs, then revival of the pipeline again. US opposed the project because of Iran, and suggested the alternative. So Pakistan would benefit. And that alternative one would bypass Iran, but it will go from Turkmenistan through Afghanistan to Pakistan, and then further to India. The thing is that this pipeline, the other peace pipeline, had to reconcile the very unstable, or pacify very unstable territory of Afghanistan, which was often in the hands of various tribes and Talibans. And so that pipeline was also called peace pipeline. So there is another peace pipeline, and it was called TAPI, Trans-Afghanistan, Pakistan, India pipeline. So this pipeline was important for the US because it bypassed both Russia and Iran. I was actually advisor of UNICL when it was still there in 1997. UNICL had a group, 5 advisors. One would advise on Central Asia. That was Martha Abril Olcott from the US. Myself was advising them on Caucasus. There was one advising on Pakistan and one on Afghanistan. And on Afghanistan, there was Karzai, I think at that time. It was just before he was elected prime minister, president. So at that time, he was just a very influential person. And I think UNICL was trying to attract, with the help of Karzai, some leaders, or try to make him help to establish contracts with the various fighting tribes in Afghanistan. UNICL had to withdraw eventually. I mean, year after it withdrew. In general, all these pipelines, it's a very long story. It's a long, long process. This project lasts for 2-3 decades and being realized or not realized in the end. Another project of peace pipeline was in Karabakh issue. As you know, let me see if we have yes. So this is the peace pipeline, the one which was first project, Iran through Pakistan, and then through Multani goes to Delhi, which was not liked by the US, and was suggested the other one. This is the alternative one from Turkmenistan, from the gas field of Turkmenistan to go via Afghanistan, and this is quite unstable area, through Pakistan and to India. So these are 2 competing projects, but they both were called peace pipelines. So Maresca's peace pipeline. So this is Azerbaijan and this is Armenia, who were fighting since they became independent after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 over this part of Azerbaijan, small part, mountainous part, which is sort of not in the middle, but at least it's divided from Armenia. So Armenia claimed, first of all, this population was Armenian, and they wanted to separate. Armenia moved in and occupied all this territory. So it's not just the Karabakh itself, but it's also 7 more regions which divided Armenia from that autonomous region. So the fighting was really very bad. Because Armenia was assisted by Russia, it basically occupied 20% of Azerbaijani territory, which remained frozen until September, when Azerbaijan managed to liberate most of its territories, but at pretty high cost. So once the peace agreement was signed between Armenia and Azerbaijan in 1994, they started peace talks. And one of the first proposals was by the US ambassador, Jack Maresca, who suggested that we should build the peace between these 2 countries on the pragmatic basis. And energy projects might be the cause of this pragmatic basis. So because Azerbaijan had enormous resources of oil in its Caspian sector, a few pipeline routes were discussed, and the main one was this, which would go through Azerbaijan to Georgia, and then to Turkey, and then to the seas and to Europe. He suggested, look, this pipeline, which would go through Armenia, is much shorter, much more beneficial in commercial terms, but also Armenia will benefit, Azerbaijan will benefit, we will benefit, international companies. So why don't we come up with this plan that if Azerbaijan and Armenia reconcile, then this peace pipeline will be operational. I was there in Washington when Sabit Bagirov, the then director of the oil company, was 92, I think. He voiced this project in the big audience with the Armenian diaspora, very rich and influential Armenian diaspora. They were very impressed, but they didn't agree. Why they didn't agree is the other issue, but we are not going to discuss it today. Yeah, sorry, we will. Yeah, I forgot to let you know that it's not, peace pipelines are at the same time, they are sources of tension, and there might be sources of reconciliation. So one of the examples of how peace pipelines might be causing tension and instability is the most recent in July 2020, yes, in July, the resumption or violation of the ceasefire was taken in totally different place. You see, here is the front line and where the fighting goes. So it's around Karabakh and 7 regions, but the resumption of hostilities took place in totally different area and quite close to the major transportation route, Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan route, which just hints that it might be Russia who is sending certain signals that it might have control over the security of the transportation lines. And we all know that Armenia is a very close ally of Russia. They have all sorts of defense agreements. They have Russian bases, they have Russian border troops. So this is the closest military ally of Armenia. And so when this violation on the Armenian-Azerbaijani front took place, you could actually guess that it might be the Russian reaction of certain developments which she was not happy with. Very recently, we had a problem between Greece and Turkey, but it's related to the gas fields, mainly in the eastern part of Mediterranean. But the tension caused by the resources and transportation routes, it's not the creating conflict. It's not starting the conflict. It's adding intensity to already existing conflicts between Turkey and Greece, between Turkey and other actors here, as well, over Cyprus, over the economic zones which overlap. And I think the president of the, or vice president of the German Marshall Fund or something, he said that we've never been in such a dangerous or highly risky situation in regards to this conflict and in this area as now. So the competition over oil adds the intensity and heighten the risks of conflict in this area. Now we come much closer to the topic of our lecture. Whether petrostates start the wars, international wars, so do they attack? The author of the book in 2013, published in 2013, his name is Colgan, he called it petroaggression. It was basically the first systematic attempt to transfer the resource curse from the domestic area to the international relations, and to see whether it works internationally too. So his hypothesis was that oil income creates incentives for applying force because it decreases domestic risks by allowing to avoid political accountability, even in case of military failure. He then demonstrated on example of the case study of Iraq. Well, some other scholars also bring the example of Iraq-Kuwait, Iran war as the case of the Rentier states wars. But there is no sufficient statistical data to support the hypothesis that petrostates are necessarily are also aggressive in their international arena. So he also adds that the actual start of conflicts actually depends on nature of regime. Those petrostates which are ruled by revolutionary leaders are more inclined to resolve the issues by force than ordinary petrostates. So he considers that revolutionary leaders usually don't care. They're high risk takers. So the revolutions usually produce risk tolerant leaders and swipe away, the revolutions themselves swipe away the institutions which could restrain the executive decisions in regards war, whether to go to war or not. So there are both absence of the institutions which could sort of restrain the leader from going into war, and also the leader personality of leader himself, that he doesn't care. So the cost of war of 8 years, the Iran-Iraq war, was quite high, 452 billions. So the rents which were coming, very intensely coming to Iraq from the oil, they supported that war. So he didn't have any consequences from the point of view of devastation in the beginning, because he also was helped by Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and United Arab Emirates, because he was given he borrowed from these countries. So what happened that when he had to pay back, he couldn't Kuwait. So one of the reasons why Kuwait was invaded, because Iraqi regime could not pay the money which finances which Kuwait gave him during the war in Iran. So however, in terms of, if you can extrapolate this war between the rentier states, Iraq, Iran, Kuwait, can we extrapolate it to regional wars in sub-Saharan Africa? There is an opinion that you can't really, because many of these conflicts existed before the resource curse started to demonstrate itself, or the effects of the resource curses started to expose themselves. And also they call it the war next door. The mechanism also played a role. So it's not so much was driven by the Rentier logic or primary commodity logic, but the phenomenon which is called war next door. So he shows you that this table shows that it was the moment when the combination of the revolutionary regime and petrostate, which made him most aggressive. Let me show you something else. Okay, so my sorry, my graphs are in disorder. So he shows you Iraqi oil production, and when actually the 1,000 barrels per day, and when the Iraq was invading the neighboring countries here and here. So 2 moments, and you can see the oil production going down, and here going down. And let me go back and show you how he proves that the petrostates and non-petrostates, he called it militarized interstate disputes per year. So among all of them, there are less petrostates. There are less non-petrostates than petrostates. There are more petrostates. Then he shows that there are more petrostates as attackers than non-petrostates, and more petrostates as defenders. But this difference is much less, that attacker between petrostate and non-petrostate. You can see that there is quite a significant difference here. He also shows you the factor. He's comparing role of democracy, revolution, and oil in the rate of international conflict. So you can see that here is democracy. Revolutionary is much higher. The increases probability of risk of the conflict, and petrostate is much higher as well. So when you combine those two, then you increase likelihood of the international or what he called militarized interstate dispute. Okay, so let me first maybe I didn't speak as I promised to Mert about TAP and TANAP. So we can, yeah, the thing is that TAP and TANAP eventually, we had two projects. One major project was Nabucco. Nabucco was supposed to take Azerbaijan gas to Europe, but that was a project backed by EU and Western corporations. Azerbaijan eventually opted for another, TAP and TANAP. TANAP was, as you correctly noticed, between Turkey and Azerbaijan, and TAP Trans-Adriatic pipeline. This was a compromise between Russia and Europe. I believe so. Maybe Professor Gubad thinks other way. But I think that Azerbaijan decided to find some reconciling option, so not to irritate Russia too much, because obviously Nabucco was too much the project of bypassing Russia, ignoring Russia. So I don't know, what do you think, Professor Ibadoghlu? Was the Nabucco project, the TAP and TANAP project, was sort of compromising solution?
I think so, because the Nabucco is directly compete with the Russian pipeline, Russian market, and TANAP and TAP targeted the source of Europe, the Balkans. As you know, the Nabucco targeted to the Hungary and the central and the eastern Europe. The route of the pipeline also was different, but both of them targeted to the Europe. But Nabucco, it's directly going to the Russian market, the European gas, and the TANAP are going to the source of the Balkans. There is a few share of the Russian gas, but the most of them, they receive the gas from the source, mostly the north of the Africa, Algeria and other countries.
Thank you so much. So I suggest I have a series of questions as to discuss. We're not many, we're just 4 of us, right? Well, and we too with Gubad. We can do it the following way. If you have any questions, you can ask now, and then we will divide into groups, 2 and 2, and probably try to respond to these questions, which I just showed you. How about this? What do you think? Okay, so any question? Or you want to start to discuss these questions in groups? Okay, no questions. Okay. Okay, 1 group and 4. Why not? I just should then put you on 1 group, but I don't know how to do it. Create breakout rooms. I'm creating the rooms, but there are room 1 and room 2 anyway. Professor Ibadoghlu, do you know how to do? I can put it just one room. Oh no, there should be minimum.
And we have the 4 participants. Maybe we will divide into 2 groups.
Yeah.
And in this case, it will be some debate between the group.
Yes. Randomly assign. Yes, I managed to assign you to 2 groups, guys. Charlie and Somaya and Jokai and Mert. And you have the questions. And you have actually probably 20 minutes because the questions are not easy, I think. Okay. So how do we, okay, create. Yep.
Yes, I start record.
Okay. Okay, Charlie, first question. Does every oil-dependent state have civil conflict?
Yeah, we made some notes, but I don't think I can access the notes anymore once the group is gone. But yeah, the answer is no. And I think part of it is that the definition of civil conflict depends on where national borders are drawn. And a lot of times the borders are drawn arbitrarily due to colonial history. And maybe the colonial history was partly influenced by countries, European countries looking for resources. But to say what's a civil conflict and what isn't is a bit arbitrary.
Okay, that's the first question. And then any country of your region have a civil conflict caused by resource curse?
Jokai can answer that better than I can for his country.
No, just the region from you and your colleague whom you were discussing this.
Okay. I thought you meant geographic region.
Yeah, well, geographic region, but of yours or your colleague? I mean, where are you from?
Yeah, well, Southeast Asia is the region. So, I mean, in Indonesia, there was a conflict between Aceh and the rest of Indonesia, which was partly caused by oil, not entirely. I think things are not so simple.
So, Charlie, whom you were with in one group?
I was with Somaya.
And she's from Iran, right?
I think so, yeah, but she can speak for herself.
Yes, Somaya, you can answer these questions also.
Yes, we can see some of the civil. Actually, they are not in civil conflict. They are international conflict, as you said about the Iran and Iraq war. And but also we can see some civil conflict in Iran. But because the government have the power to suppress this civil conflict with natural with distribution of the revenue, after some times this protest finished and terminated, but it's not very severe in Iran. But also we can see in the other country like Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and UAE that they are resource-rich countries, but we cannot see a civil conflict because of the power of the government.
So which particular conflicts were there in Iran which were sort of contained? Was it the Kurdish? No? Was there any Kurdish? No?
Current?
Yeah, was it the Kurdish rebellion there or not?
No.
No. So there were no any ethnic secessionist movements in Iran?
No, ethnic, no.
No.
Most of them, it's about, for example, about the changing the price of the gasoline and or some social conflict, not related to the natural resources. It's actually depends on the economic situation in Iran.
Mm-hmm. But you had a combination of petrostate and revolutionary leader, right?
Yeah, yes.
But it wasn't aggressive, was it?
No, it's not.
It's an interesting case then to review, because we had Iraq with the ambitious revolutionary leader and petrostate, and then we had Iran, which also had a combination of revolutionary leader with the petrostate. And why is one more aggressive than the other? That's an interesting, I think, thing. So that might be if you could think about it, and maybe Charlie also could think about it. Why in Iran the combination of two indicators which increase likelihood of conflict, why it didn't work? Huh, Charlie, do you know why?
Well, I'm not that knowledgeable about that part of the world, but I think it's important to remember the history and what happened in the 1950s in Iran. It's not enough just to look at the situation right now.
Okay. Yes. But thank you very much for your mentioning of the post-colonial sort of borders. It's very interesting, although they were internationally recognized, right? So when they are internationally recognized, does it mean anything? Or what you're saying, it doesn't mean anything, right?
Well, no, I think it means something. I mean, borders exist because governments enforce them, but where the borders are drawn may be arbitrary. I mean, Kurdistan is a classic example, right? There's no border for Kurdistan, and it's created conflicts in a number of countries in the region.
But that's a very interesting aspect. Thank you so much for mentioning it. So we have the second group, Mert and Jokai, who can speak.
Yes, should I go first or Mercy will go first?
If you're ready.
Well, yes, I can speak. The first question, yes, I think it's not necessarily every white dependent state has a civil conflict. So yeah, it's like a kind of the many oil-rich country in Middle East, like Saudi Arabia, might not have a civil conflict. And East Timor is like where Charlie is living, and it's a very much oil-dependent country. And so far, I know it's no civil conflict there.
Mm-hmm.
And for another question, yeah, in Burma we do have a kind of the civil conflict, secessionist movement, especially in the north of Burma. Like a Shan state and Shan snake, diverse ethnicities and religions. And then in northern Burma, we have a Jiv mining, a ruby mine. And then so we have a conflict there.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, oil dependent country, I think they will say have a more flexible foreign policy. I mean, they have oil, so they can deal it. So I don't know much about the country. They have a aggressive foreign policy.
Mm-hmm.
That's all for me.
Mm-hmm. I think Burma is quite torn by conflicts. There are a lot of them, right? One of the most, I think, intense in terms of the number of conflicts, ethnic conflicts and things like that, right?
Sure. We have a lot of armed groups, more than 100 armed groups.
So do you think that democracy and arrival of the democratic government helped to reconcile or resolve the conflicts?
Well, so far it's getting worse.
Eh.
Yes, it was the former military regimes and the former military leaders was before Aung San Suu Kyi. It was better than Aung San Suu Kyi's government. So Aung San Suu Kyi government just won election. So we have to wait and see in this next 5 years whether they will do better.
Does she use some qualified advisors, independent or civil society advisors?
She's famous for being alone or being like a dictator. No?
Ugh. Gee. Oh gosh. Right. Okay. So is Merkel, does she have something to say? Jokai, we're looking forward to your essay. Yeah, it seems to be quite interesting because it sort of touches upon the role of Burma in Chinese transportation routes and pipelines and the problems which it causes in Burma, the controversial nature of the pipeline regarding the locals and things like that. So it will be very interesting to listen to you, to see your essay. Mert, do you have anything to add? Mert, you don't hear me, right? Or you can't operate with your...
Mert has a problem with microphone. He add some comment in the chat box.
I'm not seeing it. Okay, now. Okay, there is no condition aggressive policy and being going from the state. Okay. I think they are. So, Sumaya, I think you asked the question. I think Professor Ibadoghlu also can look at the question and answer political corruption index. I think they are reliable. What do you think, Professor Ibadoghlu?
There is a direct correlation between the research rich countries and the corruption perception index according to Transparency International latest reports. You can find the countries like Turkmenistan, Azerbaijan, Nigeria, and Angola, and other African countries in the end of the list of the corrupt countries in the world. But
I think Samaya is asking whether they are reliable. I think they should be, right? They should be reliable. Why?
Yeah, should be reliable.
Well, they're reliable from the perspective of people in the international, usually international, but in the business sector, right? So for countries where a lot of the economy or a lot of the activities is not in the cash economy or not in a corporate economy, maybe they're not so relevant.
Interesting. Okay. So you think they're not relevant because they're too low or too high? They're sort of over...
Well, it's not ever...
Optimistic or pessimistic?
I think maybe what they're measuring isn't so important. If you're in a country where, say in Timor-Leste, in the traditional society, rural society, the way most people live, things are done by exchange, by families, by social issues in terms of marriage and things like that are related to economic issues. Debts get carried from one generation to the next. But when you interview international business people about what they think. They may see it's corruption. Other people may see it's repaying a loan that was made 3 generations earlier. So it's, not everything fits within the Western framework.
Right. Yeah. That's very correct. Mert mentioned that Saudi Arabia doesn't have civil conflict because they tend to have USA-based foreign policy. I don't know how is this related, because I thought the conclusion of the analysts and experts was that rentier states, if they have a high ratio of rents per capita, then they don't have conflict. So they have enough resources to make people happy by distribution, large distribution programs, then to feed repressive apparatus, to feed their power base, clientelist bases, right? So they do have enough resources to keep the sharing formula stable and make more or less all the agents of their power happy. It's the resource-rich but low-income countries which are most vulnerable to conflicts. I will load my presentation tomorrow probably. I don't think it stays there, but I loaded my presentation before also, so those who missed the talk, they can look through it. And this time also I will load it. So there are these moments in the presentation about when the countries have it's a weak state. So if state is weakened by the relies on rent, and it usually is because they not using taxation, not using checks and balances, not developing strong bureaucratic apparatus because they have money to replace it. Money plays the role of the state institutions, basically compensates the absence of the state institution. So then in the end, and while they have the income revenue, while they have the inflow of revenue, they're okay. So weakness of the state is not seen. But once the shock comes, then when it collapses, then when it ends up with the with conflicts, because they don't have state capacity to resolve the issue, to mobilize resources. They can only extract, not to mobilize. They don't have the capacity, state capacity. They don't have professional institutions. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with you, but I think there's another factor which has to do with repression. That when a government has a lot of resources, they can suppress conflict and prevent people with grievances from organizing and expressing what they want. But if they lose those resources, then the conflicts come out more to the surface.
Right. So it's combination, Rentier effect. It's combination of the repression and cooptation. So they have greater capacity to keep these two things strong. I think we had a mechanism. There are 4 elements through which the rentier state. You remember I told that there is a destructive effect of conflict, leading to conflict effect of resource curse, but stabilizing effect of rentier. I mean, not always rentier is stabilizing. It is not stabilizing when it has a low ratio. So it's a low income and high resource dependence country. So they maintain peace through large-scale distributional policies, clientelist networks, high spending on security, and plus external allies. In Azerbaijan, we always have that. I mean, we had a totally falsified elections in 2003. All the exit polls showed that the opposition leader won. But, you know, the US, was it Richard Armitage, or who congratulated our president before the official results were announced. So they have their external allies also supporting them. So this is just a multiple basis of survival for the rentier states. Yeah. So should we, does anyone, also securitization on energy and natural resources are important. Sure, Merit, securitization of energy and natural resources. You mean the provision of security or what? Charlie, did you want to say something?
No.
Okay. Security of energy, yeah. But it's different area. It's non-related to petrostates. Security, energy security is something else, right? Professor Ibadoghlu.
Right.
Right. Okay, guys, I would like to stop and